Well, good evening, everyone. Good evening. I want to thank you all for coming out to the first guest speaker series of 2023. And we're starting off with a bang, it seems. So this guest speaker series is something we started, well, 6 years ago now, and has grown ever since. And we're very happy to be expanding our speakers and welcoming new faces every single year, such as Kevin Pawlak, who will be speaking tonight. Kevin is a historic site manager for Virginia State Preservation in Prince, I'm going to get it right here. Prince William. I almost said another Prince. There's a lot of princes. There's a lot of princes. But he's also a guide on an important battlefield that we'll talk about today, Antietam. And he's also written several books, and one of which is To Hazard All of the Emerging Civil War series. And guess what? I have some copies here tonight. So if anybody's interested, I have them in the gift shop, and I'm sure Kevin will be happy to sign them for you at the end. He brought his pen. He's ready. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Kevin.
Thank you all very much for being here. Can you all hear me in back? I'm used to screaming about trains at work, so I'm loud if I need to be. But thank you all for being here. It's great to be here, see a lot of new faces and plenty of familiar faces as well. I'm here tonight to talk about two of my favorite places, Western New York and the Antietam battlefield in Western Maryland, which is about a 6-hour drive from here, maybe 5.5 hours if you're really pushing it, and you don't hit any traffic depending on how you drive. Now, I could have talked about, I said this to some of you earlier, I could have stood up here for hours and hours and hours talking about this, probably even days, because there's a lot to cover when it comes to not just Western New York, but all of New York State and the Battle of Antietam itself. But I know we all have a big football game that we want to go watch on Sunday, so I don't want to keep you all too long before that. But what we're going to do first is we're going to start from a real big picture just to get everybody on the same page, and then zero in on a couple of particular stories and topics related to Western New York, probably some places that many of you maybe even live in or are familiar with at least. But just a 2-minute synopsis of where the Battle of Antietam takes place in the American Civil War. September of 1862 was about a year and a half into the American Civil War. September of 1862, I would argue, was probably one of the worst months, at least at the start of the month, that the United States had ever experienced from its founding in 1776. Just a few months before, Union armies were outside of the Confederate capital at Richmond, Virginia, about 100 miles south of Washington, D.C. They were so close, those Union soldiers were, that they could literally hear the church bells of Richmond tolling on the hour. 3 months later, however, Confederate troops had reversed the fortunes of war. They were now within 20 miles of the federal capital at Washington, D.C., and that Confederate Army commander, Robert E. Lee, decided that it was time to begin the first Confederate invasion of the North, bringing his troops across the Potomac River into the North to seek a battle to try and achieve, ultimately, one major thing: Confederate independence. So there's a lot of arrows. I know there's a lot going on the map. We don't have time tonight to get into all of that specifically, but the lighter gray arrows you see here will be Confederate movements, and the darker black arrows will be the Union Army of the Potomac, moving out from Washington to try and drive Lee's army out of Maryland and get it back into Virginia, or modern-day West Virginia. That all leads to several battles. Firstly, September 14th, the Battle of South Mountain. You can see a couple of those explosions here on the map. Fighting at Harpers Ferry as well along the Potomac River. And then just a few days after those fights, ultimately the largest climactic battle of the campaign, the Battle of Antietam, named for a small, sluggish creek that flows just a couple of miles outside of the small crossroads town of Sharpsburg, Maryland. The town is only about 1,000 people in 1862. It's even smaller today than it was back then, but it leads to the Antietam battlefield being one of the best preserved Civil War sites that you can find. For the most part, what you see today in 2023 is what soldiers would have seen in 1862, with the exception of monuments and telephone poles and cars and things like that. But on September 17th of 1862, the 75th anniversary of the signing of the United States Constitution, Union soldiers attacked in multiple attacks. Again, you can see the black troops, the black lines, and the arrows in places like Miller's Cornfield, where in 2.5 hours, 8,000 soldiers were killed, wounded, missing, or captured. Attacking towards a small white building known as the Dunker Church. Then fighting moved south to an area simply called Sunken Road at the time of the battle, but forever afterwards known as Bloody Lane. Fighting was also south of town, across where Union troops fought to get across Antietam Creek at a 3-arch stone bridge that has since gone down in history as the Burnside Bridge, and we'll talk a little bit more about that this evening. But ultimately, overall, with all of these Union attacks, it was enough to eventually force Lee out of Maryland, but it wasn't an overwhelming, decisive victory. Nonetheless, though, in 12 hours of fighting outside of Sharpsburg, Maryland, there were 23,110 soldiers killed, wounded, missing, or captured, equaling about 1 soldier every 2 seconds for 12 straight hours. About 4,000 were killed outright. Another 2,000 to 4,000 died in weeks and months after from their wounds. Some wouldn't die from their wounds until decades after, and we'll talk about one of those stories tonight. But nonetheless, it was enough to drive the Confederate Army out of Maryland, and 5 days after the Battle of Antietam, President Abraham Lincoln announced to the country the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, which went into effect at the beginning of the year, January 1st, 1863, that freed about 3.5 million slaves in the Confederate States, transforming the Civil War not just from a war of preserving the Union, but also into one of trying to abolish slavery as well. Now, New York as a whole had quite a role to play in all of that. There were 67 infantry regiments, and we're not going to go too much into the details of what each regiment did again tonight, but you can see that makes up just under 50% of the infantry strength, the foot soldier strength of the Federal Army at Antietam. 14 artillery batteries, 5 cavalry regiments, 2 engineer regiments, and overall about 20% of the Union Army, over 70,000 men, on September 17, 1862, were New Yorkers. That was the largest. New York was the state that submitted the most men to the Federal war effort, and the state that submitted the most men to the fighting at Antietam itself. So we're going to pick up with one of the local units that was known as the LEROY Regiment, not entirely from the LEROY area, but also some from Rochester as well. So what I'm going to do is I break down each of these individual stories for you. Again, it's not going to be an entire blow-by-blow of the battle itself, but I'll try to fit everything into context for you. So you can see, you'll find, I've tried to make these uniform. The red circle is going to kind of draw in the attention of where these particular units fought on the Antietam battlefield. The 105th New York was part of Abram Duryea's brigade, so as we zoom in, and you can see they were the first ones heading straight into, out of, who knows, a billion cornfields that we have in the United States, the only one that's capital T, capital C, the cornfield, because of the fighting that took place there on the morning of September 17th. About 24 acres of corn owned by just a simple farmer, David Miller, and his family that lived on the north side of the cornfield itself. Now, September 17th, 1862 is a seminal day in American history, but for a lot of the people that fought there and experienced it, there were over 100,000 soldiers between the Union and Confederate armies, and countless civilians throughout North and South that were affected, of course, by the loss of loved ones, worrying about loved ones on the battlefield, things like that. It's just one day for them. We've spent 160 years studying just this one day, but it's important to remember that a lot of these people had roots before they got to Antietam itself. Just like the men of the 105th New York, they were under the command of an Irishman, Howard Carroll, and you'll find, how many of you have been to Antietam battlefield? Let's just start off. Good, okay, decent hand. Probably the most iconic monument on the battlefield is the New York State Monument, which we'll talk more about at the end, but it does have listed all of the units, all the New York units that fought at Antietam, and it has the commander as well, so you can see Colonel Howard Carroll commanded the 105th New York. Now, the 105th New York was really the conglomeration of 2 failed efforts to try and raise a regiment of troops. Now, on paper, a regiment would be 1,000 soldiers. Those 1,000 soldiers were divided up into what was called 10 companies. Each company would come from a locality, usually a town, city, or part of a city, and then they'd be all formed up together and march off to war and be federalized to be a part of the United States Army. The 105th New York was really a conglomeration, as I mentioned, of 2 failed efforts to raise 10 companies. Folks in LEROY had managed to get 7 companies together, while in Rochester, only 3 companies were able to get together. And ultimately, state authorities decided they were tired of trying to wait for those 7 to become 10 and the 3 to become 10, so they just put the 2 units together to form the 105th New York. That marriage was not all that good to begin with, because the 3 companies from Rochester were all Irishmen, native Irishmen, Irish Catholics. The 7 companies that formed from around the LEROY area, you can see Brockport, Batavia, Holly as well. They were mostly native-born Americans or immigrants, not from Ireland, so they didn't mesh too well together. Also, when the Irishmen were put into the 105th New York, the original commander of the 105th was a Methodist preacher, and of course the Irish Catholics did not like that. There is also one chaplain, only one chaplain in the unit, and he was a Baptist, so the Irish did not like that. And as soon as these 2 groups were put together into camp, the Irishmen and the Methodists, the LEROY Methodists as the Irishmen called them, initially started brawling pretty quickly. Despite that, though, the regiment was able to come together, coalesce, and by September of 1862, it was a pretty well-oiled machine. And fortunately for them, they were a well-oiled machine, but not fortunately for them, they were the first ones to go into the fighting on the morning of September 17th. They moved through Miller's Cornfield, which you can see here in the picture. This was taken on the 150th anniversary of the battle, which is hard to believe, it was almost 11 years ago now. But the cornfield starts, this is the southern edge of the cornfield, and so those Union attacks would have been coming from the background of the picture, coming towards us in our direction. The 105th New York and the other members of Abram Duryea's brigade were not supposed to be the first ones in. They were supposed to be the third ones to go into the fight, but due to command casualties and one commander actually running away off the field after coming under fire, the 105th New York, they're the first ones in. 6 a.m., they began moving south through the cornfield. Just a few minutes after 6 a.m. that morning, they reached the southern edge of the cornfield where you can still stand there today. As they did, they saw a line of about 1,100 Georgians stand up that morning, level their rifles, and point them straight at. For the first 5 minutes of the fight, those Georgians and New Yorkers began trading shots at each other. Neither side was really looking for cover at this point. They both had a rail fence out in front of them. Neither side was looking for cover, and for a half hour, they slugged it out at a distance of about 75 yards. Almost half the distance of the football field. In the fighting, many of the men of the 105th New York, of course, became casualties, including its commander, Colonel Howard Carroll. Carroll was from Rochester, well, not initially from Rochester. He was born in Dublin, Ireland, but by the time of the start of the Civil War, was living in Rochester, rose to become colonel of the 105th New York. He rode into battle on horse. He was mounted, making him an excellent target, of course, was struck in the left calf, carried from the field, driven in an ambulance all the way down to Washington, D.C., which was not a nice, smooth ride, as you can imagine back then. And he later contracted sickness and died from his wounds about 2 weeks after the battle itself, and is buried in Albany today. A great cemetery there in Albany that you can still go find. But the 105th New York was involved in the fight for only about 30 minutes, which is about all men could stand on a Civil War battlefield. They suffered 80 casualties, 9 men killed, 50 wounded, 21 missing or captured. Duryea's brigade as a whole went into the fight with about 1,100 men. In those 30 minutes, 1 out of every 3 of those men was shot. So they don't have much left for the remainder of the fight itself. At Antietam National Cemetery, there are 2 stories where we're going to highlight more stories from Antietam National Cemetery than just these 2, but I thought these 2 were particularly interesting. Corporal William Rogers and Private Alan Cook were both killed in battle. They are buried in unmarked graves in Antietam National Cemetery, or unknown graves rather, but both of them enlisted here in Batavia before going off to war. And of course, they never left, unfortunately, the Maryland countryside itself. Now we're going to jump to the southern end of the battlefield. We're not quite going in chronological order here, but by this point, the fighting has pretty much quieted down north of Sharpsburg in places like, again, the cornfield, the area of around the Dunker Church, the West Woods, and the Sunken Road becoming the Bloody Lane. By 1 p.m. on the afternoon of September 17th, there were about 19,000 soldiers killed, wounded, missing, or captured. and there are still a few hours of fighting left on the south side of Sharpsburg itself. We're going to follow a brigade of New Yorkers next, again about 940 soldiers, under the command of this gentleman here, Harrison Fairchild. Fairchild was born in Cazenovia, New York on August 4th of 1820. By the 1850s, he was living in Rochester, became a member of the state militia, or the local militia, there in Rochester. Was also president of the New Bank of Rochester prior to the war, so a prominent man. And then he rose to command these 940 New Yorkers on America's Bloodiest Day. The New York units that he commanded, those 3 regiments you see there on the left, none of them were from Western New York. They were all from New York City, from downstate, which of course supplied a lot of soldiers to New York State. But many of them were known for their distinctive uniforms, wearing Zouave uniforms, like you can see this man here in the middle, wearing baggy trousers, wearing a fez modeled off the French Algiers uniforms when the French fought in Africa in the 1850s. But these men were incredibly good. They were veteran soldiers. This was not their first fight at all, and they had probably one of the toughest tasks of any unit on the Antietam battlefield that day. Fairchild's brigade, once it made its way across Antietam Creek in a small crossing called a ford south of the Burnside Bridge, formed up into their lines, again about 900 men. For over 2 hours they sat there under Confederate artillery fire as artillery shells, 12-pound iron balls, came crashing into their ranks. One soldier said you could hear the bones breaking from those artillery shells as if it was like glass in a hailstorm, is how he described it. Then at about 3:15 on the afternoon of the 17th, Fairchild's men were ordered to advance. They had to climb the equivalent of a 20-story building while under fire the entire time. They lost about 200 of their men before they even reached the main Confederate position. And then as they did, the Confederates were positioned atop a ridge on the south side of Sharpsburg, hunkered down behind a rail fence and a stone wall, waiting for the New Yorkers to show up atop that ridge. They could see first the flags of the New Yorkers as they came running up that ridge, and then finally their heads and their shoulders, and those Confederate troops opened fire. The color guard, the men responsible for guarding the flag of each of these regiments, specifically the 9th New York, went down almost immediately. All 8 men were either killed or wounded. Everybody in the 9th New York tried lunging for that flag, trying to pick it up, and finally a French captain by the name of Adolphe Lebert grabbed the flag, lunged forward with his men, planted it on the stone wall, and for just a few quick moments, rather than soldiers firing at each other, soldiers were throwing fists, using their muskets as clubs, stabbing one another with a bayonet, and the Federal troops were able to break through this Confederate position and drive them all the way back to the streets of Sharpsburg. So this is some of that fighting you can see there along that fence and the spires of Sharpsburg in the background. The monument you see there is to the 9th New York, which suffered 63% casualties. That means 63% of the men who went into the fight were again killed, wounded, missing, or captured in a matter of about 30 minutes. Overall, Fairchild's brigade was able to break through the Confederate position initially, but Confederate reinforcements showed up. They were able to drive Fairchild's men back, and Fairchild's brigade bears the distinction of being the Union brigade that lost the second highest amount of casualties on the battlefield. 48% of the 940 men they went into the fight with were again killed, wounded, missing, or captured. Fairchild remained in the Union Army throughout the rest of the war. He came back to Rochester after the war, was prominent in local politics, died in 1901, supposedly the last surviving Union general in the city, and is buried in Mount Hope Cemetery today beneath just a very simple gravestone, military gravestone, that you can still find there. So there's Fairchild's brigade. We're going to bounce back up to the northern end of the battlefield itself, to an area on the battlefield that is one of the most iconic of any Civil War battlefield. That would be the Sunken Road, or again what came to be known ultimately as the Bloody Lane. The Sunken Road, you can see, sort of trace it here on the map. If this is Sharpsburg, Sharpsburg is formed by the intersection of 2 main roads, the north-south road that will lead you into Pennsylvania ultimately, and then an east-west road that will connect to roads going towards Baltimore and Washington, D.C. as well. Both of those were toll roads. I think we're all familiar with those in New York State and everywhere in the United States. Farmers did not want to pay the tolls to bring their goods to market in Sharpsburg, and so they used a boundary line to bring their goods to mills along Antietam Creek, and through years of wagon traffic and horses and cattle moving through it, the road literally became sunken beneath the surface of the ground itself. So Confederate troops used the road as an avenue to move back and forth undercover so they couldn't be seen by those Federal troops, but then also as, in some cases, almost an entrenchment that they could use to be undercover while those Federal troops were attacking them. So one of the Union regiments to attack was the 108th New York Infantry, known better as the Rochester Regiment. Raised almost entirely from the city of Rochester, they were part of a division of the Union Army, about 5,000 men, under the command of William French. He was known better as Blinky French or Whiskey Barrel French because of his proclivity for imbibing in whiskey. Sometimes they said on the battlefield itself. But French was leading mostly new troops into the fighting here. So for the Federal Army that had about 70,000 soldiers engaged in battle on September 17th, about 20% of them had never before been in battle. And the 108th New York was one of those examples. The 108th was, again, raised in Rochester. Oliver Palmer was their commanding officer. They went into the fight with about 750 men, and they had been sworn in and mustered into the United States Army on August 18th, 1862. They had been in the Army for 30 days. One soldier talked about, they thought, as they left their camp, that they were going to a camp of instruction to learn how to be soldiers. Instead, they are put onto one of the bloodiest battlefields in American history. That is going to be their horrible, horrendous baptism of fire that they had to face. The 108th New York is a particularly fascinating regiment, partially thanks to this man you see there on the left, 19-year-old George Washburn. He was at Antietam, was a veteran of many of the battles that the Rochester Regiment participated in, and then after the war, Washburn dedicated most of his life to gathering the reminiscences of his comrades and turned it into an excellent history of the 108th New York that contains all sorts of affidavits from his comrades about what they saw, what they experienced, what they saw about others, what they remember about their comrades who did not make it out of the war. And it really is an excellent, excellent read. It's hard to find an original copy today, but you can find it for free on the internet, of course. Where else? So the 108th New York has a lot of material about it. Here is a picture of the sunken road, or what came to be known as the Bloody Lane. This is looking from behind Confederate lines, so Confederate troops would have had their backs to us, and the fields that you can see here on the opposite side of the road are where Union troops would be attacking from, including the 108th New York. Now, because of the way the terrain features into this part of the battlefield, the Confederates were undercover and were concealed until the Federal troops were very, very close to them, in some cases less than 40 yards. The two sides wouldn't see each other because of the way the terrain unfolded. So Confederate troops were hunkered down in the road, but also the ground that you see where the Union attacks are coming from is higher, up above the road itself. And if you know anything about military history, you never want to be in the low ground, or at least rarely do you want to be in the lower position. You always want the high ground. So Confederate troops would also try to attack out of this road itself. But as French's division went forward, they went forward with one line, about 1,800 men first, and then a second line behind that, and then a third line behind that ultimately. The 108th New York was in the second line. The first line of troops, men from New York, downstate near New York City, Maryland, and Delaware, fixed bayonets on the end of their rifles. They leveled their rifles and began charging straight for the Confederate troops. They got within just a few rods, probably about 36 yards or so, of the Confederate positions when those Confederate troops opened fire, and as one Confederate soldier put it, he said the entire front rank of that Union battle line went down with few exceptions. In the first 5 minutes of the fighting, 25% of those Union troops were casualties. That first line melted away. They were all rookies too. Now it was the turn of the 108th New York and their comrades to come marching onto the battlefield itself. This is an image from the position of the 108th New York looking down towards the sunken road. Again, you can get a sense of just how close I was standing when I took this image of the road itself, so how close these two sides were fighting up against one another. And as the 108th New York was fired into Confederates in the road here, there were more Confederate troops and artillery on the high ground in what was known as the Piper Orchard, firing at them as well. So this was just an awful, terrible place to be, as you can imagine. Most Union units went into the battle carrying two flags, usually a state flag and the national colors as well. Despite that making you a really good target for the enemy on the battlefield, it was also an incredible honor to carry the flag of your country and of your state onto the battlefield itself. So those men were handpicked and selected. While you had two soldiers carrying the flags, there was also what was called a color guard, usually 8 men total, and their sole purpose was to protect the flags. They were not supposed to fire their weapons unless the flag was in danger. Well, almost immediately, upon the 108th New York coming onto the crest of this ridge and coming under fire from the Confederate troops, the flags came in danger. The man holding the state flag was this gentleman you see here in the upper right, Sergeant Miles Casey. Casey was 35 years old. He was described as a man of noble stature, and of whom it was said had seen service in the English Army in the Crimean War in Canada before coming to the United States. He was selected as our state standard bearer, bore it into battle, and stalwartly upheld it until he was stricken down. Casey was taken back to a nearby farm called the Roulette Farm, put in a barn that was used as a makeshift hospital, and while there, recovering from his wound, Confederate artillery shells were hitting the barn and hissing through the air around where Casey was, and one of his comrades asked him if he was not afraid of being shot. And Casey replied, he said, "Oh no, I am used to them." He said he had been badly struck, but guessed he would come out all right, and appeared cheerful and hopeful. Unfortunately, Miles Casey passed away at the age of 35, 13 days after receiving his mortal wound on the Antietam battlefield. He left behind back here in Rochester, back in western New York, a wife and a 4-year-old daughter. His remains were never brought back home. Instead, he still rests today in grave 553 in Antietam National Cemetery, where you can still go and visit his remains today. When his remains were buried originally on the battlefield before they were reinterred to the National Cemetery, as Casey's remains were being put into the ground, supposedly the story amongst the men of the 108th New York was that Army Commander George McClellan came riding by, asked the burial party who was being buried, and upon being informed of the circumstances of Casey's sacrifice, McClellan and his staff uncovered and remained so until the remains were lowered in the grave. Now that was all in the future for the men standing on the firing line of the 108th New York. Upon the color guard, almost the entire color guard being shot down, Colonel Oliver Palmer turned to this man here, William Bloss, who was a lieutenant in one of the companies further down the line, lieutenant of Company A, to go and form a detail of men to come and rescue the flags. Bloss was not new to being shot at. I'll explain more of that in just a moment. He was born in 1831 in Brighton. His father was a prominent abolitionist in Rochester. This is his father, also named William Bloss. Bloss actually befriended Frederick Douglass when he moved to Rochester in 1847, and Douglass credited Bloss with being one of his first friends in Rochester itself. The younger William Bloss moved out to Kansas to participate in the fighting there, the decision between pro-slavery and free state men that became known as Bleeding Kansas. He moved to Lawrence, Kansas, which is where the University of Kansas is now. Today, Bloss was a newspaper editor there, and while there, he helped to stage an escape for bringing back an African-American man by the name of Charles Fisher that Bloss thought was improperly imprisoned and was going to be taken into slavery by pro-slavery forces. Bloss gathered a force of men to go out and free Fisher. They did so. A couple of days later, while Bloss was in his office in Lawrence, Kansas, pro-slavery men came in and they shot him several times for his role in freeing Fisher. Bloss, of course, survived that to be here on September 17th of 1862. But he led his men, several men of Company A with him, to try and save the colors of the 108th New York. And as he arrived, he talked to Sergeant George Goff, who was carrying the national colors, and immediately upon arriving, Bloss wrote that Goff went down. And Goff turned to Bloss and he said, "What did you strike me for?" And Bloss had to tell him, "You were struck by a bullet, Sergeant. There's a blood spot on your forehead. Are you badly hurt?" Goff replied, "Oh yes, I can't see with my left eye." So soon enough, Goff and others that were wounded began drifting off the field as Bloss began to replace and bring those men that he had brought with him to the center of the line to protect those flags. But soon enough, almost immediately, Bloss was wounded by what he called a blinding blow, as if someone had struck me. When I came to consciousness, I was lying under the shadow of a haystack back at the hospital for the 108th New York, back at the roulette barn. Supposedly on his way to the rear, as one of his comrades attested, Bloss was yelling even though he was drifting in and out of consciousness because of the wound. He said, "For God's sakes, Troom, jam a straw up my nose, I am strangling." And as Troom later put it, he said, "We were tender in jamming, and as the coagulated blood was choking him, he suddenly snatched the straw from our hand and thrusting it up his nostrils was speedily relieved of his distress." Bloss survived his wound. He was quickly, though, discharged from the regiment because he could no longer remain in the field. He moved back out to Kansas, participated in some of the fighting in Kansas later on in the Civil War, became a newspaper editor in various places after the war, and in 1892, 30 years after receiving his wound here at Antietam, he died from that wound. And he's buried just outside of Chicago in Highland Park, Illinois. So 30 years later, he died from his Antietam wound. Now, there are more stories from the 108th New York, including the Tarbox brothers. This is both of them here. David Tarbox was the oldest on the left. Henry was younger. He was 3 years younger. David was 26 years old. Henry was 23. Both of them were born in Scottsville. And on the battlefield, they were in different companies, so different parts of the line itself. David Tarbox's company that he was with was on the far left of the Union line, and as Confederate troops leaped out of the road to try and drive the 108th New York back, they were beginning to break the line of the 108th New York. And David, or Brainerd as he was called by his brother for his middle name, as his brother recounted, waved his sword and told the boys that if they lost possession of the hill, they would lose the battle. His company again rallied and poured a volley into the enemy, and the rebels were driven back again to their rifle pits, but it was at the cost of his life. He was shot through the forehead and died instantly. 26 years old, David Tarbox is buried amongst what's called Officers' Row in Antietam National Battlefield in grave 850. His brother Henry survived, though he did not remain in the Army for long after Antietam. He was soon discharged on account of sickness and disease that he had contracted. But nonetheless, Henry went on to live a long and fruitful life as well. He was well educated, having gone to Lima College before the war, which eventually became Syracuse University. Tarbox, though, in 1865 moved here to Batavia. He may have come here sooner, and I'll explain all of that in just a moment. But he began practicing law. He served as the postmaster here in Batavia for a time as well, was a member of the New York State Assembly also, and he served as the vice president and director of the Bank of Batavia from the 1880s all the way until 1911. He died in 1916, and I've been able to trace where he lived. He was in apartment 202 of the 400, no, just kidding. Of course, that building wasn't here at the time. But this is taken from a fire insurance map in the early 1900s. This is his house, a diagram of his house, at the corner of East Main and Swan Street. So it's now where 400 Towers sits today, is where his house was. Of course, no longer standing. Tarbox is buried just a mile down the road from here off Harvester Avenue at Batavia Cemetery. Lived until 1916. This is his grave. You'll notice it doesn't have his last name on it. He was buried in his wife's family's plot. But he nonetheless rests underneath this monument there in Batavia Cemetery itself. Now, the last story that I want to share with you is going to be different from all of the other ones because it doesn't relate to a Union regiment that fought at Antietam. Instead, it relates to a Confederate regiment that fought at Antietam. And some of you may know the story already. For others of you, it might come as a shock, hopefully. But it is nonetheless a very fascinating story. So we're jumping back up to the northern end of the battlefield, to that bloody cornfield where, again, 8,000 soldiers were killed, wounded, missing, or captured in about 2.5 hours worth of fighting. We're going to be talking about a brigade of Georgians and Alabamans under the command of Alfred Colquitt. And specifically, we'll be focusing on the story of Major PHILEMON TRACY of the 6th Georgia Infantry. Here is a picture of PHILEMON TRACY. He was 31 years old in September of 1862. Very prominent man. He graduated from Yale University in 1850. He became an editor of the Macon Telegraph. He was a large proponent of secession. Before the war, being the editor of a newspaper, of course, he was able to get his message out to quite a few folks. Ultimately, Tracy also became a member of the Georgia State Legislature. He was its youngest member when he was elected in 1859. Unfortunately, just prior to the war, both his wife and his infant child passed away, so he didn't have any immediate family when the war began. But in 1861, when Georgia seceded from the United States, the Confederate States of America was formed, and many young men went off to war. Philemon Tracy was one of them, though you might have guessed, if you had known Philemon Tracy, that he probably was not quite fit to be a soldier. It was described that he was so nearsighted that if a well-known acquaintance came up to him, he wouldn't be able to tell who they were at 6 feet apart. So, doesn't have a lot of good eyesight, and also he was described as being too lame to march. So he was constantly on horseback. Now, despite those infirmities, nonetheless, because of Tracy's standing in the Macon community, he was elected as Major, third in command of the 6th Georgia Infantry itself. Just another quote here about Tracy. One man described, he said, his eloquence had done no little to rouse the people of the state to secession. Though those physical infirmities rendered him unfit for active field service, he was among the first to step forward and offer his life in defense of his country. All vicissitudes, when's the last time any of us used that word? All vicissitudes of time, whether of prosperity or adversity, had left his pure heart as guileless as a child's. He was magnanimous and liberal to a fault, and all who knew him loved him. He had a generous, brave, and patriotic heart, is how he was described. Now, Tracy led his men into multiple battles, despite having no military experience. At the Battle of Seven Pines outside of Richmond in May of 1862, he was shot through the face and in the leg. He went back home to Georgia to recuperate, and then the night before the Battle of Antietam, he joined his comrades in the 6th Georgia, by this point whittled down to about 250 men. The 6th Georgia, once it received its orders about 8 a.m. that morning, they marched north into the maelstrom of the fighting that was the cornfield. And you can see, I've tried to highlight it here, even though looking at it in hindsight, red was probably a poor choice for a circle, because there's a lot of red on that map. But nonetheless, the 6th Georgia found itself in the northeast corner of Miller's cornfield itself. They had reached the northern fence of the cornfield. Many of them were looking off in this direction at the Union troops they saw approaching, but they failed to notice soldiers from Ohio and Pennsylvania approaching through the woods on their right. As those Ohioans advanced through the smoke, their commanders actually discussed whether the troops in front of them were Confederate or Union. One thought they were Union, one thought they were Confederate. Finally, the one that thought they were Confederates in front of him won out. He was correct. And within less than 30 yards, those Ohioans and Pennsylvanians opened fire. The 6th Georgia fought as well as they possibly could. At this point, one of the rare instances of hand-to-hand combat on Civil War battlefields was fought in by the 6th Georgia and those Ohioans and Pennsylvanians. And during the fight, a bullet clipped Philemon Tracy's thigh. It severed his artery. Several of his men, before being driven out of the cornfield, tried to save him, and Tracy turned to one of them, said, "Get out, save yourself," and his final line was, "It is all over with me." The 6th Georgia, in just a matter of probably 10 or 15 minutes, 250 men went into the fight. Their total losses were 84 killed, 115 wounded, and 30 captured. Basically 90% of the 250 men who went into the cornfield, including Philemon Tracy, were killed, wounded, missing, or captured. Think about what that does to a community that's just lost all of those young men. Tracy's body was left in the cornfield. His comrades tried to get it the next day. Ultimately, they couldn't get through enemy lines, though, to get it, and Tracy expired right there in the cornfield itself. Now, despite all the people we've talked about this evening being the man that grew up furthest away from Batavia and dying 330 miles away from here, this Confederate officer is buried 1 mile down the street, Batavia Cemetery at Harvester Avenue. So how did he come to be buried in Batavia? On his trips back and forth to Yale, between Georgia and going to Yale, Tracy would come here to Batavia to visit with his uncle, who was a prominent local politician He was a judge by the name of Phineas Tracy, who you see pictured here on the left. Apparently the two of them formed quite a relationship. And upon receiving word back here in western New York that his nephew, Philemon, had been killed in action at Antietam, Tracy tried to figure out what happened to his body. He wrote to Henry Tarbox, who you see over here. That's again from the 108th New York. So again, Tarbox must have been in Batavia before moving here in 1865 for the two of them to have known each other. Tarbox said he couldn't locate the body itself. Finally, Phineas Tracy sent down what he described simply as a private emissary down to try and find his nephew's body. Finally, he did locate it, and it was decided to bring Philemon's body back here to western New York. Now, as you can imagine, in the heat of the moment, in the middle of the Civil War, bringing a Confederate officer's remains through Union lines was a tricky affair. And so it was disguised that in this casket were actually the remains of a Union officer as compared to a Confederate officer. And then, with a religious burial, Philemon Tracy's remains were buried, again, just a mile down the street from us, here in Batavia Cemetery. All that was put over his remains was this simple stone. All it says is his name, the date he died, and his age. Of course, it doesn't say how he died or where he died or anything like that. Eventually, I think after the war, I've still been trying to piece this full story together. Somebody spilled the beans about who was, of course, buried here. One of the earliest instances I can find, 1907, there was a wreath sent from a community in Georgia up here to be placed over Tracy's grave, and Henry Tarbox, who was very active in the local Grand Army of the Republic Post, a Union veterans organization here in Batavia named for local man Emory Upton, placed the wreath over Tracy's grave, but it wasn't until 1990 when Tracy's grave received this modern marker indicating who he was and why he is here. But supposedly, he is the furthest north that a Confederate officer killed in action is buried, and also supposedly the only Confederate officer to be taken from, dead Confederate officer, to be taken from a battlefield and buried in the north as well. So just an interesting connection with Antietam here, and somebody that you probably wouldn't have even guessed is buried right down the street from us here in Batavia itself. But these are just a few of the stories of thousands upon thousands of stories of not just Western New Yorkers, but everybody that experienced the Battle of Antietam. I always say, you think about the lives of these 23,110 soldiers who are affected by this, whether they survived, were wounded, captured, what have you. Those are all stories, 23,110 stories. There were over 100,000 soldiers that fought at the Battle of Antietam. They all had a story as well. There were 1,000 civilians living on the battlefield. They had a story to tell, but also the people back home in a place like this, far away from the battlefield, think about the impact that they had to deal with, thinking about what was happening to their loved ones on a field, on a place that they'd never even heard of, never even thought they would ever hear, hundreds of miles away from here on a day just like September 17th of 1862. Still, to this day in American history, the bloodiest single day in our nation's history. So thank you all very much, and I'll be happy to take any questions if anybody has any. Any questions at all? Yes?
You mentioned a Dunker Church. How do you spell that?
The Dunker Church. It varies, but I think that the agreed upon spelling for the Dunker Church is D-U-N-K-E-R. The Dunkers were a group of, they're officially called the German Baptist Brethren. A lot of them settled in the southern Pennsylvania, western Maryland area. They built just a small little church that didn't even look like a church. The soldiers that saw it thought it was a schoolhouse or somebody's house. The Dunkers were very, very simple in their religion. Again, being known as the German Baptist Brethren, they were called Dunkers because they believed in full immersion baptism. So they literally dunked people to baptize them. That's where the name came from. And many of the people that lived on the battlefields that worshipped at the Dunker Church. Now, the Dunkers also did not believe in slavery, and they did not believe in warfare. So how ironic is it that the bloodiest single day in American history is fought on land owned by people that don't believe in war? Pretty incredible. But the church survived. It was used as a hospital. Artillery shells passed through one wall and out the other. It suffered extensive damage. It was renovated, used until the 1890s. 1921, a windstorm blew the building down on top of itself into a pile of rubble. For 40 years, all that rubble sat in somebody's barn in the Sharpsburg area, and in 1961, to get ready for the 100th anniversary of the battle, local citizens decided they wanted to rebuild the Dunker Church, using as many of the original materials as they could.
Did they have ties with the Amish or the Quakers or?
It was a lot of similar beliefs, but they weren't of the same religious sect.
In Town Line in Lancaster, they seceded from the Union, and that was a basic German community in there.
Mm-hmm.
And there was 5 soldiers that joined the Confederate Army from Town Line. They seceded, and
I heard of it, yeah.
brought them back in 1952.
Okay. Even more stories to look up. Like I said, it never ends.
But my relatives are supposedly Dunkers from Pennsylvania.
Oh, okay, very cool. Yeah, so there's still
Nothing to
a
do with the donut, though, right?
yeah, that's right. That's right. There's still a large Dunker population in the Sharpsburg area today. There's plenty of Dunkers around. Yes, sir.
You mentioned the color guard.
Mm-hmm.
And it struck me that today, sometimes, like at ball games and so on, they would say the color guard will present the colors and so on. So that really is an official, maybe not official, but a military group with a purpose, going back to Civil War. And
Yes.
would you know before that? Maybe the Revolution?
Yeah, Revolution and beyond. I mean, even thinking back to European wars in the 16th and 17th century, even before that, honestly. And you think about it, get this a lot. A lot of people come to the battlefield all lead up to war. They think, why do these people line up in a long line, stand close to each other, and shoot at each other from 50 yards apart? The biggest reason is, A, they don't have machine guns. So you want to shoot more bullets at your enemy than what they can shoot at you. Best way to do that is if everybody has a single shot gun, you mass them all together, and you fire, again, theoretically, more bullets at the enemy than what they can fire at you. But also, nobody has a cell phone on a Civil War battlefield or any form of advanced communication like we have today. And so the flags were good forms of communication as well. Everybody's standing there shoulder to shoulder in tight, compact formations. You can feel if the person on your left falls down, if they move forward, if they move back, if they move to the left, if they move to the right, whatever it might be. Your commanding officer is going to be standing right behind the center of the battle line, which is where the flags are going to be, and they will tell the color company, advance, move back, whatever it might be. If you see the flags start moving forward, where's everybody else going to go? You're going to follow the flags. If you see the flags go back, you're going to go back. So they're also a good form of communication and being able to figure out who's who on a battlefield as well. Because a lot of times when you think about, I mean, both sides did wear different uniforms, but with the battle smoke, sometimes it was so difficult you couldn't see more than 10, 15 yards away from you. It was difficult to figure out who was who, and so flags would help that during the course of the war. So flags were incredibly important to soldiers, and if a regiment lost their flag, it was almost viewed as shameful. And for the federal side, at least, anybody who captured a Confederate flag, whether they captured it wrestling from a Confederate flag bearer's hands, or they just picked it up off the ground, that was almost an immediate Medal of Honor that they would receive because of how important the flags were to both sides. Any other questions at all? Yeah.
I didn't get your background, and I just wondered how you became interested in this. And
9-year-old family trip to Gettysburg from up here. Grew up in Albion, went to Notre Dame here in Batavia. Went to school 10 minutes from Antietam. Actually went to college to study Civil War history, and the rest has been downhill, I guess, from there. For a lot of people. For anybody that I drag along on these trips.
do you know a lot about New York regiments?
Somewhat. I mean, there's so many. New York, again, supplied the most men out of any northern state to the Union War. There was over 200 infantry regiments during the course of the war. They were all over the place, serving from the Eastern Theater in Virginia, Maryland, Pennsylvania, all the way out to west of the Mississippi River. So they were all over the place. Yeah. Yep. There's an excellent book, if you're really into books you want to buy. It's a 6-volume history of New York and the War of the Rebellion, it's called, and it has names of every single soldier from New York that served. It was published by a veteran, Frederick Pfister was his name, 6 volumes. You can still find it every once in a while on the secondary market.
We did it here
There you go. All right, yes. It's an excellent resource. You can find it online too, again, like anything nowadays. Any other questions? I saw one hand in the back, I thought.
Yeah.
Yes.
Of the 108th New York, you said there's 943. How many casualties?
So the 108th went into the fight with about 750 men. They lost about 200.
Wow.
Yep.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Yes.
Well, the Confederates that Fairchild's people were tangling with, was that part of a contingency that had just come in from Harpers Ferry?
So Fairchild's men, when they attacked, they were attacking Confederate troops that had been on the battlefield for a couple of days. Part of the reason they were driven back is A, because again they lost nearly 50% of their men. B, they were exhausted and low on ammunition. But then yes, also eventually you can see here on the maps, these are some of those Confederate troops that had marched about 15 miles from Harpers Ferry earlier that day. Yep, exactly, and started driving into the Federal line and driving those Federal troops back to Burnside Bridge and back towards Antietam Creek itself. Yep. Any other questions at all? Yes.
Sorry.
You want me to come back to you?
I was just about to speak.
That's all right.
In your opinion, what would be a good documentary? What would be a good film on the Civil War, either documentary or fiction?
I think historians have debated it a lot in the 20 plus years that it's come out, but I don't think you can beat Ken Burns' Civil War, the PBS.
Okay.
I think that's the best for just telling the story of the Civil War, and really something that I think we often forget is Ken Burns does a really good job of humanizing the Civil War. Remembering that even though these people lived and fought and died 160 years ago, they were people just like you and me. And I think he does a really good job of that, and explaining what the war was about, what happened in the war, how it affected people, and using pictures and words from people who were in the war to describe what the war was like. So you can find that pretty easily, again, on the internet, I'm sure, but other places too. I'd say that's probably, if you're looking for one documentary, that would be the best one.
Okay.
Yeah. Yep. Mm-hmm. Yes, sir.
Miller's Farm. What became of that after the battle?
Yep, the farm is still there. The farmhouse is still there. The barn, the original barn, is still there as well. The Miller family is still in the area. There are descendants of the Millers still there. Let me zoom back a bit to. So the farmhouse, here's the cornfield. The farmhouse is right here. Again, you can still go see it today. Incredibly, as I mentioned earlier, the Antietam battlefield is one of the best preserved fields you'll find anywhere. There's not a lot of commercialization, which is great. The Miller farm is one of those examples where, again, you can walk right through that cornfield that thousands of soldiers did on September 17th. However, that's been a long process. In the 1990s, as recently as the 1990s, Miller's cornfield was privately owned, and there was going to be a housing development built right there. So the park itself today, the battlefield, is about 3,000 acres. There, through easements and different preservation tactics, there's about 9,000 preserved acres around the battlefield. When the battlefield was first established in the 1890s, it was 60 acres.
Wow.
That's it. It was basically just the roadways and the right-of-ways. That's it. So yeah, you can still go see it today.
Did you touch on Ely Parker? He's from Akron, New York.
Yep, Parker was not involved at Antietam. He was out west at that point with Grant. I'm not sure. Grant did come to Antietam once while he was president. Actually twice. He came for the dedication of the National Cemetery in 1867 and then came again while he was president. I'm not sure if Parker was with him at all because Parker did serve with him, of course, in his administration.
Some of his artifacts are here at the museum here.
Yeah. Now one guy I didn't touch on too much, and again, as I mentioned, there's a whole Rolodex of stories I can choose from, but Emory Upton, of course, was here. He fought in the area of the East Woods. He was a battery commander, but he was not commanding a New York battery at that point. He was commanding a battery of United States soldiers, so the cream of the crop, the regular Army soldiers at that time. So Upton was there. Again, quite a few. I mean, there was a lot of stories as well. One staff officer that I found is also Robert Chandler's buried in Batavia Cemetery just down the road. So there's plenty more stories But again, to get you all out of here on time, I wanted to restrict just a few of them.
Ball game, yes.
So Ryan, I don't know if there's anything else you want to say at all. But thank you all. I'll turn it over to Ryan real quick if he has anything. I don't want to throw you on the spot.
I'm used to it by now. Well, just thank you, Kevin, again for that excellent presentation. And coming out to kick off the 2023 season. We have quite a few more guest speakers lined up for the rest of the year. Just so stay tuned, check our website, Facebook. Those of you who are members and on our email list, you'll get all that notification in plenty of time. We also have the next event going on is our next Java with Joe, which is our morning coffee group presentation. Richard Beatty will be presenting on the Darwin Martin House. He is actually a tour guide there, so he'll be delving into the history of that structure. But we also do trivia nights, and we'll be doing a lot of other major events going on. So the best way to stay informed is to become a member, and it is the beginning of the year, so you can get your full benefits if you join now. Other than that, I do have some copies of Kevin's book if you are interested. And thank you again, Kevin, for coming out.
No.